Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the H.F. Langenberg Memorial Speaker Series. Beyond. This is our first event of 2025, and I think it's going to be a great one. The Langenberg Series is brought to you by the Hammond Institute for Free Enterprise. That's part of the Plaster College of Business and Entrepreneurship here at Lindenwood University. I'm Grant Black, Acting Director of the Hammond Institute, and your host for tonight's exploration into the fun world of tariffs. Since its inception in 2017, the H.F. Langenberg Memorial Speaker Series has aimed to bring leading intellectuals right to our doorstep here in the St. Louis community, sparking meaningful discussions that resonate all around us. Thank you all for joining us tonight, whether you're here in person at Lindenwood or tuning in online. Your enthusiasm for exploring ideas that shape our lives is what makes events like this truly special. I encourage everyone here, whether in the audience or tuning in virtually, to connect with one another. Take a moment now. If you'd like to introduce yourself to people that are around you, and for our online participants, don't hesitate to share your thoughts and questions in the chat throughout the event. I want to recognize those whose generosity and ideals make events like this possible. Harry and Nina Langenberg and the Hammond family. While they all couldn't be with us in person tonight, their support has been invaluable to our mission at Lindenwood University for many years and for many years to come. Let's thank them for their continued support. Before we begin tonight's discussion, we want to announce our next Langenberg Speaker Series event. Our special speaker will be Steve Forbes, the chairman and editor-in-chief of Forbes Media, as well as a previous presidential candidate, so he's quite familiar, I would say, to most of you. He's well known for his ability to intersect social issues, economics, and policy, and that event will be Thursday, September 18th, here at Lindenwood University. So be on the lookout for more information to come about that. Tonight's topic of tariffs is timely, it's relevant, and it's often not well understood. As you well know, tariffs have become a household word, a daily news report, and a policy tool tied to a wide range of feelings. This evening, we have the privilege of hearing from Nicolas Ziebarth, whose insights on the dynamics of tariffs are, I think, going to be enlightening, be informative, and I think quite objective. So you all can make your own opinions as you walk away. After his initial remarks, we'll have Nicolas respond to questions that have been submitted by participants. And if there's times after that, we'll try to open it up to the live audience here as well and those online. We had people submit questions ahead of time as well. Give you a little background on our speaker. Dr. Nicolas Ziebarth is the Sam B. Cook Professor of Economics at the University of Missouri in Columbia. He's a research associate with the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's the co-editor of the journal Economic Inquiry. Prior to joining Mizzou, he was a faculty member at Auburn University and the University of Iowa, and was a visiting scholar at Northwestern University and the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. He has had his research widely published in numerous journals, including the Journal of Economic History, the Explorations in Economic History, the Journal of Business and Statistics, Economic Inquiry, the American Economic Journal, Macroeconomics, and the Journal of Law and Economics, and the Journal of Economic Perspectives, just to name a few. That's not the exhaustive list. In addition, his research has been funded by organizations like the National Science Foundation, which is quite challenging to have done. He's well-versed to lead our discussion tonight. So please join me in giving a warm Lindenwood welcome to Dr. Nicolas Ziebarth.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out. We might have to go before Steve Forbes. I think about that. I have never been a presidential candidate. I never will be. I would just like to let everyone know that for the record. So again, thank you for coming out. So the title, I think, describes itself. So we're going to be talking about tariffs tonight. Again, this is something that I think we all have now more familiarity with than we maybe ever had cared to beforehand. But before I talk about tariffs, I want to start by talking about something simpler, because I think often when we start talking about tariffs, international trade, people get like really confused, and there's all these like big things going on, and it's really complicated and hard to understand. I want to start small, okay? I want to start by talking about why economists think that trade between individuals, just little individuals, is a good thing, okay? And so I want to start with just a little simple example here. This is going to be the extent of the math in this lecture, nothing more than this, okay? So there's going to be a few numbers and a couple graphs there, but no algebra, no calculus, none of that. This is just a very simple example where we have two people, Alice and we have Bob, okay? And so this is what Alice and Bob can produce. They produce apples or oranges. And these numbers here tell you how much they could produce if they stuck all of their time into producing that good. Okay, so Alice could produce 4 apples if she put all her time into that, 12 oranges if she put all her time into that, and for Bob, he would get 2 apples and 2 oranges. Okay, so let's just think about what would happen in what we call autarky. Think of this as a world where you're not allowed to trade. Okay, so we're going to think about a case here where what Alice does is she ends up putting 3/4 of her time into producing oranges and the remaining of her time producing apples. How much does she get? She gets 1 apple and 9 oranges, and that's what she gets to consume, right? There's no trade. So everything she produces, she eats. What about Bob? Well, we're going to assume Bob spends 50% of his time doing both of these things. So he's going to have 1 apple and 1 orange. Okay, that's how much he's going to consume, right? So that's autarky, as we call it. That's kind of the fancy word economists like to use. You can think of it as like a trade embargo. These guys are not allowed to trade with one another. Now, what if they're allowed to trade? Okay, what if they're allowed to engage in free trade? What's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is that Alice, she's going to specialize. That's the key thing about trade, is trade allows for specialization. So Alice is going to specialize in producing oranges because she's relatively more productive at producing oranges. And Bob is relatively more productive than producing apples. Notice that if you sort of looked at this, you would think that like Alice is better at producing apples and she's better at producing oranges. That's true. But what trade is about specializing in what you're relatively more productive in. Okay, relatively more productive in the sense of how much you have to give up to produce 1 more unit. And in this example, Alice is relatively more productive at producing oranges than Bob, and Bob is relatively more productive at producing apples than oranges. And so what they're going to do is they're going to specialize. So Alice is going to produce 12 oranges, Bob is going to produce 2 apples, and they're going to trade. Okay, so in this example, what happens? Alice is going to send 2 oranges to Bob, and Bob's going to send her 1 apple. So what do they get to consume in the end? Alice gets 1 apple, 10 oranges, and Bob gets 1 apple and 2 oranges. What does this mean? It means that Alice and Bob are both strictly better off than in autarky, right? Alice is consuming the same number of apples, but strictly more oranges, and Bob is consuming the same number of apples, but strictly more oranges, okay? So what that means is that free trade has made everyone strictly better off, okay? That's like the essential basic core insight of economics. When people are different, right, when they have different skills and they can trade with one another, that trade is non-zero sum, okay? If I get something, it doesn't mean it comes at the cost of you. Both of us can be made better off. And that's what this like really little simple toy example captures, okay? So when we go and we think about international trade, we think about countries trading with one another, and we ask the question, why might international trade be good? It's the same exact argument, okay? It's the same exact argument at, the level of a little individual, just scaled up to a country, okay? So the reason why economists think in general free trade is a good thing is because countries are different, just like people, right? Different countries are good at producing different things. And maybe because, like in this example here, Saudi Arabia has a bunch of oil underneath the ground. And so they're really good at producing that. It could be that some countries have a lot of labor relative to capital, like say China. But in any case, for whatever reason, wherever you think that comes from, there's going to be differences across countries, and those differences are going to be the basis for mutually beneficial trade, okay? And this like basic insight, and this goes back 200 years. This goes back to David Ricardo in 1817. It goes even further back to You can almost see the roots of it all the way back in Adam Smith when he was writing The Wealth of Nations. And so, basically for the last 250 years now, or 210 years, 15 years, however many years you want to count, economists have basically been trying to like blow up this argument. That's what we like to do. Economists are known as a very cantankerous bunch. And economists have been working on this and thinking about this and coming up with all kinds of stories. So here's one story people will tell why free trade isn't good. Think about Saudi Arabia again. Saudi Arabia is very rich, yes. But they also have an economy that's exceedingly distorted. It depends essentially on what happens to the price of oil, right? Like that's everything. The price of oil goes up, it's fantastic in Saudi Arabia. The price of oil goes down, it's terrible, okay? And so you can imagine that, in a world where everyone specializes in one particular good, that's going to make, your country very susceptible to shocks, right? All of a sudden the price of oil falls or something like that. So that's one argument people have made against this idea of specialization. I think there's something to that. I don't know how far it goes. I mean, if we think about our own lives, you probably have a job, and you're sort of specialized in producing in one thing. Would you think you'd be better off if, say, you took 50% of your time out of your job and you went and, you grew chickens in your backyard and sewed your own clothes so that you were more, self-sufficient? I don't know. I mean, I can't make that decision for you. I can tell you, I don't think I would be better. So that's sort of like, but like at this basic core insight, right? The core insight here is that, countries and individuals, they should produce what they're relatively good at and buy the rest, right? That's like the core idea here. And that is like a very, very powerful intuition, okay? It's a very powerful intuition. So with that in mind, let's talk about tariffs. So obviously up till now, we've been thinking about kind of very extreme circumstances, right? The case of autarky, trade embargoes, and, complete libertarian utopia of perfect free trade. Obviously, that's not like what we have in reality. What we have is something kind of in intermediate, right? We have tariffs. Okay, so what's a tariff? When you think about it at a really basic level, a tariff is just a sales tax. That's what it is. It's a sales tax that's imposed on goods that are imported. Okay, that's really all it is. So when economists get upset about tariffs and they complain about tariffs, why do they get upset about that? Because they think that tariffs prevent specialization, right? They gum up trade. Okay, why do they do that? How do tariffs gum up trade? It's because they drive a wedge between the price that the seller receives and what the buyer pays. Right? There's a gap between those things. That's what a tariff is doing. Okay, so let me show you just like a little example of how that works in practice. So here's a bottle of a very fine bottle of wine. This is the Chateau Lafite Rothschild, so one of the finest wineries out there in the world. And so if we're in a world without a tariff, okay, I looked this up, and a bottle of Chateau Lafite Rothschild sells for about $500 at retail. Okay. We're going to make this super simple, right? So we're going to forget about, like, say, markups and things like that. And what we're going to simply assume is that the importer, AP Wines, that's the U.S. importer of this particular wine, paid Chateau Lafite Rothschild $500 for this bottle of wine. Okay, so that's the world without tariffs. Okay, very simple, very, very simple. So what happens when we have tariff? So here we go. Let's think about now we have a world where we have, say, 200% tariff. Okay? What's going to happen? Well, let's assume for now, so I have a question mark here because this is something that we don't actually know is going to happen. But, let's assume that Chateau Lafite Rothschild continues selling this bottle of wine for $500. What's going to happen? The importer, AP Wines, they're going to buy this bottle from this winery. But now what are they going to have to do? So they're going to have to pay that $500 to the winery. And now they're going to get slapped with a bill from customs for $1,000. Okay, that's what this 200% tariff means. 200% of $500, it's $1,000. Okay. So then what are they going to do? Eventually, this importer is going to want to sell their product along to the final, the retail market. And in this case here, again, we're going to assume that there's no markups and all that stuff. They're just going to sell it for $1,500, right? The sum total of 1,000 plus 500. Okay. So notice here that, this is something that people talk about a lot when you talk about tariffs. It's, they'll say things like, foreigners paid the tariff. So there's kind of two ways to think about that question. As a statutory manner, that's not true at all, right? Who pays the tariff? Importer, the US importer, right? That's importing these bottles of wine, okay? They're the ones paying the tariff. So I know someone who works for a small toy company. He was telling me about how, this was just about a month ago, the toy company had imported a bunch of toys from China. Imports showed up. Next day, they got a bill from customs, $87,000 that they paid. Okay. Wasn't the manufacturers of those toys back in China that were supposed to pay that. It was the US importer that had to pay that. Okay. So that's the sense in which a tariff is like slightly different than a sales tax, right? Because in a sense, in a tariff, it's the buyer that pays the tax. Whereas if you think about a sales tax, you go, out to dinner or whatever, come with the bill, they slap on the sales tax. Like in effect, it's really the seller there that remits that to the treasury. Okay. But that whole thing about statutory stuff doesn't really matter. Okay. From an economic perspective, what we care about is who really bears the cost of the tax, right? Who really bears the cost of the tax? And that's a question that goes back to what I have here in question marks here, okay? The question when we think about who bears the cost of a tax, be it a tariff, a sales tax, whatever, is what happens to these prices here when the tariff goes up or down, okay? So notice in this case, in this example here, what happened to the price that Chateau Lafite Rothschild receives? Nothing, absolutely nothing, right? They still get paid $500 for their bottle of wine. So in this scenario, what that means, it means that us here in the US, all the rich snobs that are buying this bottle of wine, they're the ones that are paying this $1,000 in tariffs. Okay? So obviously that's a very extreme example where this price doesn't change at all. Okay? What kind of world would that be? That would be a world where, the producers have a very easy time finding other buyers. Okay? If they can't sell to the US market, they'll sell to China, they'll send to Britain, they'll sell to wherever. In that world, all of the costs of the tariff are going to be paid by the buyers. Okay? Again, in a different world where it's really hard for these guys to find other buyers, then more of the cost is going to be borne by these guys, the foreigners. Okay? So, when we think about this economically, who's paying the tariff? Yeah, it's really about, how much power, how much market power in some sense do these sellers have? Okay. So that's sort of like a very simple, quick summary of how economists sort of think about tariffs. What I want to do sort of for the rest of the talk is give you a little bit more kind of a historical background of tariffs and eventually, hopefully, maybe get to talking about the most recent tariffs from Liberation Day. So what's sort of surprising, maybe not, I sometimes find surprising, is that, given all I've been telling you about how great free trade is, how we should be sort of skeptical about tariffs and so on, historically, tariffs were the norm. That was like the most common thing in the world, okay? So this picture here shows you a measure of sort of the effective tariff rate in the US going all the way back to 1790, okay? And as you can see, like, back here in the 19th century, tariffs were super high. Okay, tariffs were super high. You're talking above 30, 40, up to almost up to 60% in some cases. The world that we have today of relatively low tariffs is really an anomaly, right? It's really something that happened after World War II. Okay, so tariffs have really been sort of the norm over the long sweep of history. So, so you can kind of see if you sort of stare at this graph, you can see some kind of famous tariffs, some famous tariff policies. So like here, 2018, that was the first round of Trump tariffs, if you remember back to the first Trump administration. It was before COVID, so I have no idea what happened before COVID. It's just like a complete black hole in my mind. But supposedly there was tariffs put on. There was a first Trump administration. It was a thing. So that's what it was. Tribute, right? What about Smoot-Hawley, right? People probably heard about that. Very famous tariff that people like to talk about. 1930. That's when Smoot-Hawley goes into effect. There you go. They get like 10%, 5% spike in effective tariff rate. What about this one? This is 1861. This is the Morell Act. Pretty impressive, right? That's pretty impressive. We go further back, 1828. I see it here. That's the famous Tariff of Abominations, which is like a great term. In some ways, it's actually like one of the precursors to the Civil War. So Senator at the time, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, implored his South Carolinians to nullify that tariff and said, don't even think about enforcing this. Okay? So tariffs have been a topic of hot debate for very, very long time, as you can see. Okay? And so, one question then you might have is, again, if tariffs aren't so good, aren't so hot, why have they been so common? And the first argument for that, first explanation for that is money. Government needs money. So this picture here shows you, again, going all the way back to 1790, what percentage of total federal revenue came from tariffs. Okay? As you can see, up until basically the start of the Civil War, there's some weird spikes here, but it was pretty much all tariff revenue. That was it. That was how the government funded anything they did. Okay? Then you can see this big drop during the Civil War. What's that about? During the Civil War, for about 10 years, we had an income tax. So that's why you get this big spike. Goes away in 1871. And then, we still have a pretty high level, not as high as before, of revenue coming from the tariffs. And then you get this big drop here. What happens here in 1913, 16th Amendment, income tax. Boom. Okay? So historically, the government, and this is not just something, special to the US, this is, across the world, tariffs have been a major source of revenue. Why? Well, tariffs are actually really easy to collect vis-a-vis income tax, right? If you think you go back to the 19th century, there's like basically no enforcement, right? There's no federal government, right? And so, how are you going to get money? I don't know. You build these beautiful customs houses in a few big port cities. You send out a few agents, and you bring in your money that way, right? So, being able to enforce an income tax and actually collect that requires a lot of bureaucracy. It's very hard to do.
It's easy to calculate too. I mean,
yeah, sure. It's absolutely easy to calculate too, right? So that's, I think, a main reason why, tariffs were very popular back in the 19th century and why they've sort of gone away over time. Another reason, a more cynical reason, politics, okay? So here's a kind of a famous quote from Milton Friedman talking about the benefits and the costs of tariffs, pointing out that, the benefits of tariffs are highly concentrated, let's say, okay? The people that are, being protected can see that, right? The steel workers can see that they're being protected by these 25% tariffs on import steel, right? The harm, that's a lot harder to see, right? I mean, maybe the people that are like directly buying steel can see that the prices of steel gone up and, shake their fists. But like the rest of us, we're like the final consumers of steel, in the form of buildings or cars, we don't really see that as much, okay? It's hard to like see those costs. So let me tell you my favorite example of this. This is a FanJules.
Yeah.
So this is a very prominent, famous family from Florida. Okay, they're actually Cuban immigrants. You can kind of see it here. So they're standing in front of their company headquarters, Florida Crystals, or you might know Domino Sugar. This family is owns one of the largest sugar refiners in the whole country. Okay, they're worth billions of dollars. Sugar is one of these very strange products that I don't really fully understand why, that has been tariffed by the federal government since the beginning, since like basically 1798, one of the first acts of Congress that put in place a tariff. Sugar has been tariffed, okay, for 250 years now, okay? You go back and look over, say, the last couple decades, and you look at the price of sugar in the US relative to, say, the price of sugar outside of the US, it's ranged from somewhere 250% higher to like 20% higher, okay? Where are those higher prices going? Where are those higher prices that all of us are paying when we go and we buy a bag of Skittles? Where is that going? Going to these guys, okay? What do they do with a lot of that money? Buy off politicians, okay? So the two brothers here, I'm gonna get this wrong, but I think this one is Alfonso, this one is Pepe. Alfonso, he is a major donor to the Democratic Party. He was a major funder of the 1992 presidential campaign of Bill Clinton. Pepe, major Republican funder. He hosted big fundraiser for Donald Trump at his mansion in the Hamptons, okay? So you see this story play out over and over again. There's discussion, there's talk about, we're going to get rid of the sugar tariffs, or we're going to do this or that. And all of a sudden, some Florida politician who maybe got a few dollars in the fan jewel starts saying, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. Okay. Yeah, this is a very clear example of, again, concentrated benefits to the tune of billions of dollars at the expense of all of us, paying a few cents more when we buy our bag of Skittles or anything with sugar in it. Now, to be fair, right, like this goes in the other direction, I guess. You also hear stories about people, basically asking for special favors, getting exemptions from tariffs. So again, this is, maybe you forgot about this and all of the, humdrum that's been going on. But initially, these most recent round of tariffs on China, that, I don't know what they're at now, 145%, we're supposed to apply to everything. And then all of a sudden, you might have missed it, like a day or two later, Trump administration says, no, we're not going to apply this to electronics. There's going to be an exemption for electronics. What happened? Supposedly, Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, which has a lot of production of iPhones, China, got on the phone with President Trump, and we walked that back. Okay? So, again, I have nothing bad to say about Tim Cook, the FanJules. These guys are great business people. But this is what you should be doing in defending your company. But it illustrates some of the problems and some of the reasons why that we end up in a world of high tariffs, and tariffs that are set, again, not necessarily on strictly economic basis. Okay, so I got like 5 minutes more to go here. And so what I want to do is I want to just kind of lay out for you a few what I think are common tariff misperceptions. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A. So I'm going to go through these fast. And then I want to, again, hopefully eventually talk about the reciprocal tariffs. So first common tariff misperception that you hear a lot, and this one drives me absolutely insane, absolutely nuts, is that imports reduce GDP. No, they do not, okay? GDP is about how much we produce, okay? How much we produce. How much we import has absolutely nothing to do with how much we produce, okay? Nothing, okay? So imports do not reduce GDP. They have no connection. What about this one, which we've already kind of talked about, that foreigners are going to pay the tariff? There, again, that's a trickier question, right? But at least to the, the best estimates we have as economists is that it's actually very little, right? So these Trump tariffs, the first round, the best estimates we have is that like 95% of those tariffs are paid by us, by Americans, okay? So that's why I say a little bit, right? They pay maybe a little bit. What about this one? This is something that, again, the president has talked about a lot, that this idea that by increasing tariffs, we're going to reduce the trade deficit, right? The trade deficit is just the difference between exports minus imports, right? So if that's negative, that means we're importing more than exporting. Seems obvious, right? Like we increase tariffs, that's going to reduce imports. help the trade balance. It's actually not that simple, okay? It's actually not that simple because the flip side of a trade deficit is related to how much capital is flowing into the country, okay? And that's related to how much the country is saving. US is not saving very much, okay? As you know, the government is running a massive budget deficit. And without a fix to that, it's going to be really, really hard to fix the trade deficit problem. So here's another one too that people like to talk about, which is this idea that, if other countries are tariffing our goods, then we should be tariffing our goods. This is, I would say, probably not true. Again, I think there's some arguments you can make here about negotiations and things like that, but at least it's a matter of economics. This is not the way to go, okay? There's a classic line from Joan Robinson, who was a famous economist back in the 30s. She probably would have won the Nobel Prize if she had lived longer. That, if your neighbor's coast is rocky, the way to respond to that is not to throw rocks into your own harbor. That's not what you do, okay? And so then the last one, and again, I think people think about a lot, is this question about this idea that tariffs are going to save manufacturing. They're going to bring back manufacturing. I'm really skeptical, okay? For years, what's happened to what's happened to manufacturing share of employment over the last 70 years, right? So this is basically starts at the high water mark of manufacturing just after World War II. As you can see, it's not a very exciting line, honestly. I mean, well, I guess it's an interesting line. It's just steadily going down, but you don't see ups, you don't see downs. It's just going down, okay? Down, down, down. And, as you saw from before, right? What was going on during this period of time? Yes, tariffs were going down, but not that much, right? You're talking about maybe 5 percentage points relative to what we saw in earlier times where, tariffs swung wildly, okay? So to me, I think the real story about what's going on here in manufacturing over the last 70 years is a story about automation, right? It's a story about manufacturing businesses becoming a lot more productive, not needing so many workers. It's not a story about tariffs. And the idea that we're going to be able to, slap big tariffs and bring back manufacturing seems like a little bit of a stretch to me. Okay, so last thing. What happened? What happened at the beginning of this month? What happened on Liberation Day? Here's what happened on Liberation Day. So technically, this number here is the number where we are now after all of the reciprocal tariffs were paused. Look at this. I mean, this is just an incredible, incredible shock, right? So it's incredible in two ways, not just like the magnitude of this thing, but also because the US today is has a much larger share of imports in GDP. Okay, we import a lot more stuff than we did, say, back in 1930 in Smoot-Hawley. Today, that share is like 15%, right? Back here in Smoot-Hawley, it's like 5%. So we have this massive spike, right? And we have an economy that's much more dependent in some ways on imports. But the president likes to talk about how he wants to take us back to the early 20th century, back to the golden days of Teddy Roosevelt, William McKinley. If you go back here, yeah, we're going back. We're going back, baby. So again, I think what sort of running out of time. So I just sort of want to end by going back to this. I think this question here that I started with, this description of tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary. I don't want to actually answer that question for you, okay? I don't want to answer that question for you. What I've been trying to do here, what my goal has been, is to try to sort of explain to you how economists think about tariffs, okay? I want to try to give you the economic way of thinking about tariffs. And as painful as it is for me to say this, as a card-carrying economist, the economic way of thinking is not the only way of thinking, okay? It pains me to say that, okay? But it's true, right? And all of these issues, when we talk about tariffs, when we talk about tax policy, when we talk about monetary policy, yes, they have an economic component, but they also have a values component. They have a moral component. There are questions about what do we want this society to be, okay? I, as an economist, can't answer that question for you, right? I can't tell you if, it's worthwhile for all of us to pay, 25 cents more for our socks to make sure that we can restart some textile factory in rural North Carolina. I can't tell you that, okay? I simply can't. And honestly, I'm grateful for that because that question is a whole heck of a lot harder than what we have to do here as economists. Thank you.
Well, we're going to have a little bit of a chat. So I'm going to join him up here, and we've had some questions that are raised. You can all be thinking of your questions. So we're going to start with a few that'll give you a little time to kind of think about some things. Given all of the recent changes, I think we'll start with this question. If tariffs can have potentially negative effects, and I may ask you to kind of dive in a little bit more in the next question on people and businesses, what could a government do to address what we might think of as unfair trade advantages by other nations that have been part, obviously, of this current debate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying, this question of, how do you respond to unfair trade practices by your, competitors or your allies? I mean, I think there's maybe something to be said that you have to escalate to de-escalate, right? That somehow you have to be willing to threaten to throw up high trade barriers to get people to bring them down. I think that's maybe the best, explanation or theory of what's been going on so far in these trade negotiations. But that's tricky, right? I mean, it's tricky because then, what happens when it falls apart, right? When those negotiations fall apart, are you really willing to pay those costs, right? And I think that's kind of where we're at now is I think the market is beginning to wonder, the financial markets are beginning to wonder if, the Trump administration is really serious about being willing to pay the costs that would come with actually sticking to these reciprocal tariffs that are now paused, but may come back, who knows, right? So, again, I'm not a negotiator, so I can't tell you like that's the way to go. But I mean, I think that's maybe the best argument in my mind, right? In that, as an economist, I'm always sort of working, I would like to work towards free trade, right? And I would not like to, I would not like the US's response to unfair trade practices for us to be, well, we're going to throw on more unfair, we're going to throw on our own unfair trade practices and subsidize our farmers and subsidize this and subsidize that. I would not like that, right? I would like us to, use the threat of that to hopefully maybe push us back to, a world of free trade. I guess I put my cards on the table there.
What do you think the most likely effects of these current tariff policies could be in the shorter term and maybe the longer term? Obviously, lots of people are concerned about prices, effects on jobs, and different kinds of sectors.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, I think that's what's been really shocking for people is just the uncertainty. I mean, it's just like hard to wrap your mind around a bit. Let me tell you a story. So I somehow, my friend, won a lottery to get tickets to go to the Masters this year. So we got to go to a practice round on a Monday. So it was August 7th, 5 days after Liberation Day. And we were sitting there in our little apartment in Augusta watching the futures of the stock market on that Sunday. And, it's going down, down, down. And we were, making these macabre bets on what's going to happen, how much it's going to be down. And I don't know if you guys know about the Masters, they have very many rules there. Okay. One of the rules is no cell phones. You cannot bring your cell phone in. Okay. And so we got up that morning and went over the course, left our cell phone, and I went, what's going to happen? What's the world going to be like in 3 hours? I spent a blissful 3 hours walking around Augusta National, eating pimento cheese sandwiches, buying as much merch as I could. And I came back, looked at my phone. Oh my God, the market was like up. What the hell is going on? Well, it turned out while we were there walking around, there was some shady rumor on Twitter about how they were going to pause these tariffs, and the market went, euphoric. 3 hours later, the White House walks us back and says, no, that was just fake news. That's been basically our lives over the last 3 weeks, right? And that's just not a world where, businesses are able to make investment decisions, right? And make any kind of forward-looking decisions if you have no idea what the world is going to look like in, a week, let alone a day or a year, who knows, right? And so I think that's like the biggest problem in the short run is that, there's just so much uncertainty right now with how these things are going to shake out that I think it just freezes people in place. Long run, it kind of goes back to the uncertainty. Like, it's hard for me to predict the long run because I have no idea what we're going to be in the short run, right? So, again, I think we're definitely moving towards a world where there's going to be some amount of decoupling from China. Something's going to happen there, but how much? Who knows, right? I mean, we are just in a very different world than we were a month ago, just a world with many more possibilities, let's say. I'd like to be able to tell you that in a month, we're going to have a clearer idea of where things are going to be and how policy is going to evolve. I have no idea. Who knows?
Maybe as a follow-up to that, thinking about potential effects, how would you think, for people who are sitting here thinking about how much more am I going to pay at the grocery store or, at the mall? How is my business going to be affected? Our supply chains, messed up. How do you see these potential tariffs or the ones currently in place affecting things like that, at least in the short run? And what could people sort of expect?
Yeah, I think it's these tariffs as they are now, as of, I don't know, what is it right now? 7/15 on, April 24th, the year of our Lord 2025. Even if these stay in place for the remainder of the term, you just saw the picture. You see it right there. This is a huge, huge shock, right? Huge shock to trade costs. Okay. And again, in an economy where trade is just a much bigger piece of the pie, right? Relative to, again, any time in our history. So there's going to be effects on prices. There just has to be. How much? Again, that's a tricky question, right? That goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, right? How much are importers going to adjust their prices in response to these tariffs? Are they going to eat all of the tariff costs? I don't know about that. So that toy example I was telling you about, I was talking to this person again who works at this toy company that had this big bill from the customs, and I said, "What are you guys going to do?" Right? He's like, "We're just going to slap on a special Trump tariff surcharge on the price of the good to basically cover the cost for this tariff." If that's the world, then that's going to be a world where prices are going to go up. It's as simple as that. How fast is that going to happen? How fast are you going to see this happening? Again, that's hard to say. I don't think we've seen those things start showing up in the data yet. As you can see, stuff is happening in the financial markets, but that happens like instantaneously. But in terms of like the real economy, actual investment, consumption, that sort of stuff, we haven't seen it yet. But I think, in the next month or two, you're going to start seeing things happening.
As a follow-up a little bit to what you were talking about earlier, someone had asked, well, tariffs may not be the best solution based on what we've been discussing tonight. It's certainly one of the arguments for these policies that are in place, thinking about trying to rebuild American manufacturing. How might you think about how does a nation like this get back some of that domestic manufacturing where you're trying to increase either production levels, employment levels? And a more fundamental question I think I would add is, should we do that?
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky question. I mean, again, that is a question that's, again, goes into the realm of political philosophy and economic, or outside of economics, strictly speaking. But I mean, to me, I would think there's a couple things I think are important to think about. One is, when we're talking about bringing back manufacturing, are we talking about bringing back manufacturing production or manufacturing employment? Because those are really two separate things. I think bringing back manufacturing production is probably more doable, but bringing back manufacturing employment, that's going to be really hard for the reasons I was telling you about. I mean, manufacturing plants are just so highly automated right now. You just don't need that many workers to run those things. So I think it's just going to be downright impossible to bring back manufacturing employment to get anywhere close to where we were in the high point of manufacturing back in the 40s or 50s. I think that's just out of the cards. Okay, again, could you do that? I mean, like, sure, I guess, right? I mean, you could imagine trying to bring back industries that are, say, much more labor intensive, right? So you think about some of these, like, but you can look at your shirt, one of your shirts right now, it probably says it comes from like Bangladesh or Vietnam, one of these countries. Textiles, that actually still is a fairly labor intensive industry. Okay, maybe we could try to bring that back here to the US, get some manufacturing employment, but then that goes to your question, is like, do we want to do that, right? Is like, do we think that textile industry is like the wave of the future, right? And that's how we're going to build this glorious new age. Kind of skeptical about that, right? I'm kind of skeptical about that. But again, I think we as a society and our politicians, we have to again think clearly about: are we looking to get output, or are we looking to get employment? And then, yeah, I think we need to like really think carefully and precisely about, okay, yeah, what are the things that we really feel like we need, right? Like this just kind of general, we're going to try to fix trade deficits. No, I'm not down with that. Like, if you think we really need to have pharmaceutical manufacturing and it's not good if it's produced, or drugs are produced in China or India, okay, fine, let's talk about that. And let's be clear and upfront about the costs associated with that. And fine, we'll have an argument, okay? But I think kind of the general idea we have now, where we're just going to try to tariff stuff to kind of fix trade deficits overall, it's just a recipe for disaster. I think we need to be very clear about what our goals are, what we're trying to do, and then tailor solutions specific to that.
I'll ask one more, and then I think we'll see if there's any questions online. And then open up for the room in the last few minutes. Someone had asked, how could the government handle trade policies for resources that can't be produced sufficiently in America? And this might be one of our agendas to try to move things back. And they gave an example of thinking about tin for batteries, and we could think about other kinds of things. What do you think?
I mean, if we can't produce that good here in the US, I mean, there's nothing we could do about it, right? I mean, if we don't have any tin, we're not going to into alchemy here and, turn lead into tin or whatever. There's nothing you can do about that. And so, I mean, that's a case where I think the argument is strongest to have free trade, right? That's a case where we, the US, have no bargaining power, right? We just have to like take it, okay? And so, in situations like that, I mean, again, I think the argument is, yeah, free trade. Right? A tariff isn't going to get you anything, right? A tariff is just going to be, we, the US, basically paying the tariff back to ourselves. That's it.
Maybe I'll ask one more. That was asked, what do you think the best argument for tariffs, at least from an economic standpoint, or if you think from other standpoints, would be in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, I think I sort of quickly touched on one argument where, I think one concern you would have with kind of this completely free trade specialization world is, that can lead to a situation where a country's economy is just unbalanced. It can be very subject to particular shocks, right? Like, again, think Saudi Arabia. think that's one argument, that you might want to have a more balanced kind of portfolio of industries. And so maybe you need some tariffs to help kind of, again, diversify. There's like an old argument which kind of comes in and out of favor that again goes back to like Alexander Hamilton, this idea of an infinite industry argument, this idea that somehow, if we can just protect these industries for a little bit, right, they're going to develop the necessary skills and capital, and then we're going to be able to take these tariffs off, and it's going to be like world beaters, right? And I think this is kind of the idea of like the CHIPS Act, where we're going to give some subsidies to these, plants, these semiconductor plants here in the US. It's going to be temporary. We're going to help them get big. They're going to learn how to produce, and then we're going to take it away, and we're going to have these great champions that aren't going to need protection for forever, right? Sometimes I think that's an okay argument. And then maybe the third argument is that, again, in the world we live in now, where, as I was mentioning, and everyone knows, the US government has a massive budget deficit. We do need revenue, And so, you could say, well, yeah, I know that tariffs are distorting, but we need some money. And so maybe it makes sense to try to raise a little bit of additional money from that margin, that maybe is actually easier to do, right? I mean, that's what I think is kind of funny about this whole Trump tariff thing, is it's like the one case where the Republicans have actually acquiesced to a tax increase, right? I mean, you've seen what's happened, just recently, where there's been floated this idea of we're gonna maybe let taxes go up on the millionaires. We're like, oh Lord, no, right? But Republicans so far, except for a few exceptions like Rand Paul and Ron Johnson and stuff like that, have been kind of okay with Trump effectively raising taxes, right? Again, sure, some of that's being paid by foreigners through lower prices of imports, but a good chunk of that is being paid by us here in the US. And, I mean, if that's how we got to get more revenue, sort of secretly through this backdoor way, yeah, that's okay. I don't know.
Hey, do you know if we have any questions online? None? Okay. Anybody in the room have questions? I'll bring the mic around. Let me say this for a little ground rules. This isn't sort of a debate period. This is more just sharing questions. Obviously, this is a hot topic.
Thank you for being here and sharing your knowledge with us. Do you think a zero tariff, global zero tariff would be the goal? Or if we should have some tariff, I see with their chart there's always been some tariff. Would there be an optimal tariff level that could bring in revenue and not damage trade that much? And if there is an optimal level, what do you think it might be?
Well, I mean, again, as I said, my predisposition is towards a world of free trade. So, zero tariffs all around. So that's going to be where we're not going to bring in any revenue. I mean, if we're going to take that off the table and say, well, we're going to have some tariffs, how should we do it? That's a tricky question. Again, I think this is something that the Trump administration sort of went back and forth on, as far as I can tell, with these reciprocal tariffs. There was like an idea that like we're just going to do, and that's kind of, I guess, what we have now, right? Like a world 10% uniform tariff on everyone, right? Whereas, reciprocal tariffs 1.0 was like, we're going to have higher tariffs on Bangladesh, and there's going to be like this island where they're just penguins is going to get some other tariff rate and all those other things. I mean, I think that both of those have arguments for them, right? I mean, one argument, again, to kind of go back to what we were talking about with like, why do we have tariffs why do we have tariffs back in the 19th century, is that they're pretty easy to collect. And, a uniform tariff that's going to apply across the board to every country, it's going to be a lot more easy to collect. It's going to be a lot harder to gain than, a world where, there's a vastly different tariff on, say, goods from Britain than there is from the EU. And then, all of a sudden you got these like transshipment things where all of a sudden goods that were really produced in the EU are being shipped through Britain. So it looks like you get the lower tariff. It's like a nightmare in terms of just implementation. So, I think that's like kind of a practical reason why you would like a uniform tariff, but that's kind of like suboptimal, because like, I mean, different countries are different, right? They might be doing different things. And so, we might like to, optimally set different tariffs on different countries, depending on what we're importing from those countries, whether we have more market power vis-a-vis those other countries. And so, I think, I don't know, if you had like perfect enforcement, yeah, you'd probably want to go like country by country and be like super precise on this is what we need to set given, what we know about the world. But government's not that, the government's not that, clever. So that's why I think probably, we're gonna end up in a world where, yeah, there's probably gonna be something specific for China. And then my prediction, my guess, you can probably almost certainly gonna be wrong, is like, we're gonna be in a world where tariffs are gonna be high on China. I don't exactly know what that'll be. They'll be high, and the rest of the world will be like 10% or something like that. That's my prediction.
Other questions? Yes.
Good presentation, but I'm reminded of the quote by Harry Truman that I want to hire a one-armed economist so he can't say on the other hand.
Yeah. Oh, fair enough.
Wait a minute.
I was gonna use the Harry Truman code, but I won't. Given that you just had the discussion about whether or not pure reciprocal tariffs equal a free market or not, just at an elevated income level for the countries, would you agree with the idea that our primary focus right now with tariffs is to institute some sort of leverage on trade negotiations?
Guess so. I mean,
On the other hand,
I mean, this is not me dodging. Well, it's kind of me dodging. It's more just I really don't know. I mean, I think this has been something that the world has been trying to figure out when it comes to the Trump administration. Like, what is the end game here? What is the goal that we're actually working towards, right? I mean, sometimes it's like, yeah, we're working towards free trade. We want to get everyone's tariff barriers down and disappear. Other times it's like, no, we're working towards a world where there are no trade deficits and we want to bring in a lot of money with the tariffs. Those are like just like completely inconsistent worlds. Like not all of those can obtain at the same time. So that's why I'm like kind of dodging here, because like, at least for me, maybe the president knows what he's looking for. He's trying to be kind of ambiguous about this. I don't know. But at least from my perspective and what, I see from reading the news is like, everyone else doesn't really know what we're trying to get to here, right? And they kind of throw out different things at different points in time that aren't always consistent with one another, right? Again, who knows? Maybe there's some master negotiation behind that. I don't know. But at least from my perspective, it's very hard to understand what we're working towards. And so that's why I just don't know what the goal or what the strategy is here of putting these tariffs in place and like, okay, what are we working towards? I just don't know.
I think we have a question online. Just hang on. Your question, Matt? Here we go. What are the practical effects of tariffs on industries where there's no equivalent domestic supply or production of the imported goods would exist?
I mean, so I think that would be I think that's kind of the case of like tin, right, that we were talking about, right? I mean, that's going to be a case where, you would expect the US domestic consumers in the US to pay all the tariff, right? That the price would just go up and we would have to eat it in that case, right? Like we just have no market power in that sort of scenario. If there's no other alternative, then the the, producers are just gonna hold the price of what they are, and the final price that we're gonna pay is whatever it was before plus the tariff. That's what you would expect.
Take one more question, sort of formal question, and I'll take this one here. If you're willing to sort of just stick around and chat with folks, we can do that, but we'll formally close after this question.
My question is about non-tariff trade barriers. Do you have any information as to how the US Trade Office, how they estimated and brought it in as a percentage when the tables were showed that these foreign countries had, 140%, 180%. But when you look at the published tariff rates of those countries, it's 20%.
Yeah.
So somehow from 20, they are saying it's 120, which must mean that it's the non-tariff trade barriers that they estimated so heavily, right? And my question is, after you go through all this problem and try to regularize tariff rates, isn't it the case that the countries that want to reciprocate could just reciprocate in non-tariff measures, which would effectively be the same thing,
Yeah, I mean, let me take the first question about how they measured it. It's a good story. Yeah, so I don't know if people remember this again, but this was very early in the Trump administration. They made this announcement that we were going to do these reciprocal tariffs, and there was going to be this big investigation where they were going to go through and measure every single country's official tariff rates and all these non-tariff barriers. So currency manipulation, subsidies, all this stuff. I remember when I saw this, I was like, you gotta be kidding me. Because they were we're gonna do this in 2 months. I was like, that was a decade-long project at least. And so, then they have this, Liberation Day, and they say, here you go, here are these reciprocal tariffs that we've calculated, right? That are supposedly, the sum of the tariff plus the non-tariff barriers divided by 2 because we're being generous, right? So quickly, people figured out that that's not at all what they were doing. Instead, what they were doing was they were just looking at countries' trade deficits with the US, and were setting the tariffs basically proportional to what the size of the trade deficit was, right? So if the US had a 35% trade deficit with Bangladesh or whatever, then the tariff on Bangladesh was going to be basically that divided by 2, again, because we were being generous. And then other countries that actually were running trade deficits with us, like say Britain, we just put 10% on them for whatever reason. So there was no actual investigation into what the rates, the tariffs and the non-tariff rates. There's no investigation. It was just simply a formula based on the size of the trade deficit. That was it. So when your other question about could you do other things? Sure. I mean, you look at, you look at what happened with the first Trump administration where there were these, initial round of tariffs with China. China retaliated, said, we're not going to buy, your soybeans. What does Trump do? We're going to hand out billions of dollars to our farmers, right? I mean, that's a form of a non-tariff trade barrier, right? Like a subsidy you're giving to this one particular industry, right? In response to something else that someone was doing in terms of trade. So yeah, that's always a possibility. There's no way around that, right? So.
All right, well, thank you. Well, join me in thanking our guest speaker. We appreciate you so much coming out tonight, taking up your valuable time to spend a bit with us. Please be on the lookout for future events on timely issues like this. Definitely keep the event in September on your mind and put it on your calendars early. And feel free to stick around, chat with one another, network a little bit, grab a little bit more food, come up and chat a little bit, ask the questions that you didn't get to here. And thanks so much. We'll see you next time.